All right, hello again. This is Philip at thebest3d.com, and using a different audio gear here, as I would perhaps call it. It's not the very best audio. I apologize for that. Currently traveling here with a laptop. Don't have my regular headset. All right, enough said. Let's focus on what we want to do. We want to take a picture and kind of fly through it or explore and pan around. So I'm going to go take this one. And that's a fairly high resolution image. And then the first thing we'll do is we'll store image copy. So we have easy access to that. In fact, we might want to do that again for another picture. That's exactly why we do this in this case. We may have a lot of pictures, and one of them or two of them we may want to store. So let's see if we can get another one somewhat related to the one we just had a little bit earlier. Perhaps one is a close-up of the prior, or maybe they are slightly different in scope. Let's take this one here. Alright, so we have, I hope I didn't pick the same picture again. Nope, looks a little bit different. Let's go here, store that one too. So we now have two stored images. Let's go back to the first one, just click it and zoom out. I can use the thumb wheel on my mouse to scroll back if I have the keyboard focus. Otherwise, use the Control and Shift key both down at the same time, and right click to drag back will give you the full size. You can also use these arrows here. By the way, I'm using a version here which is beyond version 9.6. It's going to be eventually called Howler 10. It's still a beta version in development for another 2 months maybe. What you see here though is that it's a fairly large image, right? We can see on the image info that it's 5,000 pixels wide, and now we want to do an animation where we choose a small portion, perhaps to give you an idea. It might be a rectangular area like this one. Let me make this a bit easier to see if I show overlay. All right, so this area here is what we want to see. And then I'm using the Control key to drag this around to change or translate the alpha selection, just to visualize what it is that I want to do. I want to do sort of a panning motion across that and turn this into an animation. So there's a couple of different ways to do that in Dog Waffle. One of them is to create an animation not from this image, but rather have this image in the brush. Right? This is a paint program before anything else. So if we learn to think through the brush, it will often make things a little bit easier. And in this case, what I'll do is clear that selection and then just pick the whole thing up as a brush. There it is, brush, use the selected as brush. Right? So the entire image now becomes a brush, custom brush. You can enable the preview PRV in version 9.6 or little eye icon here. And then you see that it's in your brush. As you move the mouse around, it's going to show that with not full opacity by default. We can certainly go here and make it fully opaque. And the speed at which it does that depends a lot on what else is going on your laptop. I'm doing some screen capture here, some fairly high resolution, and it's not the very fastest computer either. So bear with me here. I'm going to undo this preview and then store the brush, store and manage a copy. So that's very similar to storing the image, right, that I currently am looking at here. But now on the brush, I have this image. I'm going to store and manage a copy. That image which is in the brush, you could actually have loaded directly. If you go to the brush menu, you can open and go straight to the folder where you may want to load an image directly as well. So let's say, for instance, we wanted, in fact, to have yet another one. Let's take this one. All right, so when I load this into the brush, it replaces the prior loaded image in the brush, not this one that you see here, but the one that's in the brush. And you can store that one as well, store and manage a copy of the current one. So now we have two stored images. You can minimize those if you don't need to make many changes to them. And then so each of those allow you to quickly make them the current brush. You click this, that's the current brush. You click this, that's the current brush. All right, so this current brush image is fairly large, and it's going to be bigger than our animation. The dimensions of our animation is going to be maybe 640 by 360 or 1280 by 720. Let's go and create a new image for that and give it the right dimensions. Something like, let's say 960. I think we may have a 960 by 540. That's a quad HD resolution. And it looks a bit widespread here, a little bit distorted. Let me just double check. Image info. No, it's right. It's just because I have a display. That's a bit a widescreen display. So at any rate, the image that I have in my brush, if I click this, it's in my brush. If I stamp it down, it's definitely bigger than the image I'm looking at here. So this is now a small viewport, so to speak, into a portion of the image that's in your brush, right? So you can drag around and you can see a portion of that image being displayed that way. What I'm going to do is now create an animation placeholder. Right? So that could be with something that's initially blank. Let's go and erase this. It's initially blank, and I'm going to create an animation placeholder. Right? So create from the animation menu. Let's do a very simple test with just 30 frames and make sure it plays at 30 frames per second once we have this animation created. Right, so now we have a placeholder with 30 empty frames. These are all basically duplicate copies of the initial image we had, which was a blank white image. But you have those 30 frames right there, and you can play through that. Now you don't really see much here, they're all identical, but we know that that's going to be our animation. All right, so what we'll do now is make sure we have this image as the current one. Click it to make sure if you're not sure if that's the current image, and then use what we call the brush keyframer. Right, with the brush keyframer, and again, this is only one of several ways that you can use to create the effect, but I think this is a somewhat powerful way to do it. The brush keyframer will take the current animation right here in this little floating window, and I encourage you to make it the size you need it to work with it comfortably. And then load, or you can do the get brush, it's already done that, and then you can move it around here and basically preview what part of that large image that comes from the brush, what portion of that large image you want to use. Now when you think about it, the brush was very large, and in fact if you make it normal size here, get out of that minimized state, you'll see that you can make it a little bit smaller, and you could for instance make it very small. And if you do that and then get the brush, it's now actually fitting into the preview. It's now smaller than the entire image. All right, so the idea really is to think of the brush as the placeholder for a much larger image. Here it is, just slightly larger. And if you go back to the 100% or reset it to the original size and get that brush, you have really a very large preview of it. Now, so one thing you can do is now keyframe the position. You can go, for instance, from this position, and you see down here the scrub bar. These are your 30 frames on the timeline. Right? So you can go and keyframe that. You can say, okay, let's go create this as a keyframe, and there's a little red tick mark there. And then you could say, let's go to the very end, and all I want to do is just move it sideways a little bit. Now, sometimes you reach, with the mouse here on the left side, you reach the end of the screen, and you can't go further. You can't move it further. So what happens is that you probably need to make this, either move this over to the right side so you actually do have more leeway, you have more range, but you can also make this smaller and then everything is scaled relative to that, right? So you get even more range to move it all the way to the edge, right? And so let's say we wanted to go about, about this far, where we see part of that preview here. Then we can go and take it back here and keyframe that. All right, so now we have two keyframes, and it's doing a movement, a side movement across that image. All we got to do now is render it. Now there's one more thing here. There's an option for linear. By default, it's some sort of a spline interpolated movement, but there's a little bit of a truncation error that accumulates over the frame count. So the very last frame will be a bit of a choppy jump. You might see a little bit of a very nice smooth movement for most of it, but at the very end, not so smooth. For something like this straight, you might want to actually do a linear transition. Click that and then render. All right, and so now what it's doing is simply blasting that brush image at different positions with a linear interpolation across that entire path. and we're done. We've created this little panning motion. Now this is a very fast one, very short example. Let's create something a little bit bigger. Let's go with a bit more sophistication into this. So one thing we'll do initially, we'll start from a blank, although it doesn't really matter. It will get overwritten later on anyway. But still, just to get a visual of what we're working with, we'll go with this time with 200 or 300 frames. That's there, 300. And always keep an eye on the maximum, the amount of memory needed. You want to make sure that that's not going over 2 gigabytes, because that's where Windows or 32-bit applications have problems. So let's go and allow that to create a new animation. Let's position that with the move tool a little bit to the upper right. Let's make sure it's showing it at full size, although it doesn't really matter here yet. We're not previewing it yet. But we do have 300 frames now, and we can use the brush keyframer again. Now this time I'm going to use still the same image, so click that to make sure that's the loaded brush, and then go to the timeline editor. Not the regular timeline, not this one, but the brush keyframer. There you go. So the brush keyframer again is here, and now what we'll do is a panning motion. First of all, we'll need to kill the prior keyframes if there are any. So I would encourage you to click that, and then make sure you're at the very beginning of the animation right here, and then make sure you get the brush in case it didn't load yet. All of that should have happened right from the beginning. Now, one thing I'd like to do is actually not just a panning motion, but also a little bit of a zooming, and maybe we'll do a combination of several things. So at first I'm going to use the scale here to scale it down a little bit and bring it down to something where it's just about the size. You know, it's not very exactly there, but very close to filling the entire size. And I'm going to keyframe that, right? Then into the animation a little bit, I will zoom in. So let's go back here and bring it on up to about this level. Keyframe that. Right? And then a little bit further, I'm going to still zoom in a little bit more, but not quite that much anymore, just a little bit. And now I'm going to start moving up to a little bit this way. Keyframe that. And then I'm going to go perhaps up. Now you got to be careful there with, it's always taking it back to the absolute position when you start moving around here. So this is good. We can go like this. And then here we'll probably want to zoom in even more. So let's go to the height of the peak here and go intentionally above it here, and then zoom in even more. Something like that. And again, you may need to make this a little bit smaller in the preview of this floating window, so you have more control of exactly where you go as you move this large brush image around. And you notice, by the way, there is a couple of lines, dotted lines showing. That's the path of our moving brush as we keyframed it. All right, so one more thing here. I'm going to probably want to do a nonlinear transition. So I'm going to turn that off. If I turn it on, it's going to do sudden jumps as I move from one direction to another. I might want to do a bit more of a spline interpolation there and give it a bit more of a smoothed approach. There are a couple of other things you could do, and that's perhaps to fade it. Maybe at the very beginning, you see these keyframes here. They right now only change position and they change the scale. But what you may want to do also is perhaps a fading from the original image to a new image, right? The new image being the one from the brush coming in. So what you could do is also change the opacity here. And I would do that, for instance, here. It's going to be a bit tricky to find that exact location if you want to keyframe it there too. But make sure you set it in such a way that or maybe here, just a little bit before that, you want the full opacity reached. So make sure you set the opacity here to the full, right? And then go back to this level. The very first frame, easy to reach, just go to the very left. And then set the opacity. Oh, that was the scale. Let's set the. In fact, we could even make the scale a little bit smaller than the full image. and then have the opacity go down all the way down to 0. In fact, even the angle too, right? So you can do a little rotation there as well. So it kind of rotates into place. But especially the opacity, let's bring that down to 0 and keyframe it. So that's going to overwrite the opacity here. And now as you preview, you see there is a blending in, there is a rotation, there's a bit of a yanking around here because we didn't go to exactly the same keyframe. You always want to kind of preview that or pre-plan it, because you can certainly go back to the keyframe, but it's you don't have a navigation to go just straight to exactly that keyframe, so you have to kind of find it. And if there are many keyframes, I mean many frames there, it's a bit tricky to find the exact one here. It's going to be touch and go. You can see here, if I'm trying to find it, probably this left edge of this block here lines up with the red. Let's see if we can kill that keyframe. No, I must have missed it. So let's go a little bit further. Oh, there it is. It went away. So now I can go and well, just leave it that way. You know, I don't need that second keyframe I had here, since this one here is just fine. So now you can see the preview. It's doing a rotation, it's doing a blending, and then I'm doing my regular movement. And then at the very end, it will have reached that bottom, the top of the peak here. So let's go and render that. And it's basically now transforming this brush. That's why we call it the brush keyframer. It's rendering the brush as it's being transformed across its scale, its angle, its opacity, and its position. So that's basically one interesting approach to use to create a variety of transitional animations from just a single static image. Right? You could use this to just move sideways or up and down or diagonally or in any direction, really. You can use it to just change the angle, just rotate something up. And you may have noticed how we did that sudden jump at the very end. That's the thing I mentioned earlier. If you're not on the linear transition, it's going to do a little bit of a sudden jump at the very end. So you might possibly want to have that last frame deleted. Consider it basically a little bit of a garbage. Yeah, you want to remove that. So let's delete this one. And so now we have a nice little smooth animation, and we play it right there. 30 frames per second, nice animation. All right, so that's that for a quick intro on how to use the brush keyframer to do this effect, where you pan around, rotate around, scale through, fade in or out, or even fade over an existing animation. Right, because basically the fading that we did here was against a series of white blank images that we had before we finished this rendering, and that could have been another animation to begin with. So we can also use that to render something on top of another animation. All right, well, thanks for watching. We'll have other tutorials with perhaps other approaches and other ways to do that. And in fact, let me do just one more. I wanted to show one more thing, which is how to get one image transitioned to another. Okay, so that would be going from this one to that one. Although these are too big, so I'm going to start with something from scratch here. I'm going to go and say create something new. And this one's also going to be 1960 by 540. And this time I'm going to load this image, but I'm going to scale it in, center it, right? Scale to fit, there it is. And then I'm going to, well, maybe we need to have it at this size anyway, so I'm going to store this version. There you go. So we have this image, it's a little bit smaller. Maybe we don't need a large one anymore. Kill this. There it is, that's a small one. And I'm going to create an animation of just 2 frames. Right? Just 2 frames at first. Now, when I do a 2-frame animation, right now both frames are the same initial image. I'm going to go to the second image and load this one in as the second image, again scale to fit. So we now have these 2 images. This one I'm also going to store, so we have a smaller version stored away. This big one we don't need anymore. There is a small one. Okay, so we have 2 images, this one and this one, and we have them both in the same animation. 1 animation, 2 frames. What I can do is turn this into a longer animation simply by right-clicking here and doing a time stretch. Right? So before I do this, I'm going to store this animation because I may want to do a couple of things with it. Let's store this to disk. Quick and easy, just 2 frames, very short animation. And the thing I want to do is turn this into an animation, and I can right click here to go to time stretch and tell it, shutting down any second here, and tell it to go twice as long, so that's 4 frames with frame blending. That's important. You make sure you use frame blending here. So I'm going to go to about 128. And then at this point, you now see you have essentially a blended transition going from one image to the next in time of 128 frames. So that's what we just created, simply by taking one frame and then taking another image in the second frame and then extending that with time stretch. So that gives you some ideas of how you can do blended transitions from one image to another. It's not the only way to do it, it's just another way to do it. All right, thanks for watching. We'll do more very soon.